All right, so for today's fantasy film room, came up with a pretty. I came up with the idea. For once, I had a good idea. I don't have very many, but I did have a. I don't even know if it's a good idea, but I had an idea. The whole concept here was. Since it's a new film room, Nate's not with us here on this one because we've got Boone. I was like, what if, Boone, you give me 3 wide receivers that you're really curious about. I'll put them into my charting list this week. I'll dive into the film and we'll bring some takeaways here. You'll give us some fantasy expectations. I'll give my kind of takeaways on what I'm seeing on film. So the 3 players that Boone, and I was like, pick anybody in the league. Anybody. The 3 that he came up with was Ricky Pearsall, Michael Wilson, and Wan'Dale freaking Robinson of the New York Giants. And man, I have been really mean to Wan'Dale Robinson. So, and I have yet to capitulate to the Discord bros in Reception Perception who want me to chart Wan'Dale Robinson. I've yet to capitulate. And finally, Boone, you forced me into it here.
I forced your hand. I mean, there was like a little bit of a narrative with each guy here. The Ricky Pearsall one's also funny because that's the one where you dropped him in the office league and we joked, could that turn out to be a sabotage drop? And I mean, through 2 games with him on my roster, it's looking very much like a sabotage, man. I don't like this at all. But I was curious just to see, is there any hope potentially for Ricky Pearsall? The Michael Wilson one is interesting with the Marvin Harrison Jr. angle and when he comes back, what that could potentially mean. And then, of course, Wan'Dale's just always, PPR scam Wan'Dale's always funny when it comes to you.
Absolutely. Okay, so we're going to go player by player here. And I will just say before we dive into that, 2 of the guys here, Michael Wilson, Wan'Dale Robinson, I did not chart last offseason. So these are some fresher takeaways with these guys, just because this is the first time I've looked at them in the last year. And by the way, Boone, there's always a handful of guys every offseason that like just miss my list of players to chart because I can't get to like 100 wide receivers in the NFL. And then during the season, they end up having moments and it just kills me that I don't have an updated profile. But luckily, I do have rookie year data and prospect data from both those guys. So not completely coming out of the cold here. But let's start with Ricky Pearsall because I think he is the one that people might be most curious about, Boone. So dove in and I charted this game against the Panthers for him. I will say, I think Pearsall looks fine as an individual player, still separating really well, getting open down the field. I think the 2 biggest levels of concern for Pearsall right now are number one, from not a his skill set or his play perspective, but I think that he is clearly and obviously the vertical guy of this offense where he's running a lot of these deeper patterns. And because of that, I think he is naturally going to be boom bust, right? And we've already seen that, this happens when we try to do these wide receiver splits. We just focus on what's happened recently. We forget what's happened before. The first 3 weeks of the season still happened when he was top 3 in the NFL in receiving yards and he was hitting on those big plays. Then these past 2 games since he's been back, the big plays are not being hit. I do think that's going to lead him to being a lower targets, per route type of player when he's primarily like his 2 most commonly run routes in the games I've sampled so far have been dig and out routes, which like when he hits those, it's going to be really good, but it's not too dissimilar to Brandon Ayuk when he was that guy. Now they don't play the exact same role, whatever, but he was the kind of running the most difficult routes on the team player, and Ayuk would have these big games, and then he would have kind of whatever games. Pearsall's just been a little bit more dramatic. I think he's not quite as good of a player as Ayuk at his peak, but still really solid. So I'm not worried about Pearsall himself, and I could live with this role. My problem, though, Boone, is that I come away from this game really concerned about what I saw with Brock Purdy, and I'm hoping that it's just rust. But the biggest thing for him is that I think Purdy, when he has been at his best, he's been one of the premier anticipatory passers in the NFL. I think I know I was getting excited about this on other shows. Maybe I got excited about it with you, but when Purdy threw that dig route to Pearsall against the Raiders in the preseason, I was like hooting and hollering over that because that's the plays that he made with Ayuk where he would throw that thing when he was still on the stem before he even broke. And I tweeted the play. It's on my Twitter feed if people want to check it out. One of the interceptions, the J.C. Horn interception on Monday night that Purdy throwing to Pearsall. Pearsall breaks and Purdy's just holding it. He hitches and then he throws it, as opposed to when he's on Pearsall is on the stem, anticipates and throws it. That's pretty troubling for Purdy. And I think we saw a lot of that in the game before. He just kind of got away with it. So I'm hoping that we can explain all of this away as just a minor blip for Purdy and it's just rust. But to me, that's actually the biggest concern I have right now with the Pearsall stuff.
Yeah, I mean, rust, or is Purdy 100%, or is that impacting him, the injury that he's been dealing with, right? And I thought you might even bring that up with Pearsall. Like, is Pearsall 100%? Because we saw him take a while to get back, and the PCL injury, it makes me worried about a guy like, Drake London. We've seen other players come back and not necessarily be as productive right away. When we do get Drake London back, could that be an impact? I also think it's not great coming up here for the 49ers if you're worried about Purdy coming off of this game. Because this week, they got to go against the Browns, right? The weather in this game does not look good. We're talking about some rain. We're talking about some sustained winds that could be over that 15-mile-per-hour threshold where it starts to impact deep passing. And who would that impact? Oh, that would impact Ricky Pearsall, right? So that looks like another game where I think we're going to have Pearsall ranked lower than usual, where I don't know that he's going to come through. Then we got to bye in week 14. And then you come back to a really good schedule, as you can see there in the fantasy playoffs, the Titans, the Colts, the Bears, all top 10 in terms of most fantasy points allowed to wide receivers. So there's potential there for a guy like Pearsall to come through. But if you have a down week this week, if you have a bye week, he's another one of those players that you're not really going to want to put him in your lineup come week 15, even though it's going to be a great spot on paper.
That's a really good point. Everybody, that loves Pearsall, myself included, will be like, oh man, look, he's crushing it in week 15. And all the responses will be, yeah. And nobody started him, which is kind of fair because my first thought before I watched this game back, I was looking at Pearsall because I still think he's their best man coverage receiver from a separation standpoint, from a route running standpoint. I was looking at that Browns matchup thinking, okay, well, this maybe is a good bounce back spot for Pearsall because that man coverage that they play. But you mentioned it's outdoors, it's in Cleveland. Also, they got a guy named Myles Garrett who might break the sack record this year. And I think the other thing that was troubling with Purdy was his response to pressure off the edge. I don't think it was that interception. I think it was one of the other, he threw a few. One of the other interceptions he threw in that game, he had almost a damn Shador Sanders like response to pressure where he's like drifting back behind the tackles and he throws the pick. I'm like, Purdy, this is not the guy I remember. So maybe it is just as simple as we get through an ugly game here in Cleveland, we get a bye, and then those 3 games, it looks good for these guys, but it will be interesting to discuss if we can trust Ricky Pearsall as somebody we want to play. But my overall take on him as a player is still very, very positive. I just think he needs to get a little healthier. Purdy needs to get healthier and knock off the rust. I'm not too panicked, but obviously concerning signs. The interesting one, let's talk about Michael Wilson next, unless you got anything else on Pearsall.
No, I was going to say, let's go from the guy who's had barely any production the last 2 games to the guy who's had all the production the last 2 games, at Michael Wilson.
Great transition, Boone. It's almost like you've done this before. Michael Wilson, only receiver in the NFL with more than 20 receptions and 300 yards, either. Both. Like, he's the only one who has more than 300 yards. He's the only one who's got more than 20 receptions in the NFL the last 2 weeks. It's Michael Wilson. I was talking with James Coe about Michael Wilson earlier today. He had 36 combined yards in the first 4 weeks of the season. He has 33 targets over the last 2 weeks. James noted that he had just about 10 yards per game in the first 4 weeks. He averages 9.2 yards per target over the last 2 games. So it's just some insane stuff from Michael Wilson the last 2 weeks. And you know what, Boone? The film absolutely backs it up, bro. Like, he has truly been playing to this level. It's not, look, we can discuss whether it's sustainable, whatever, but this isn't a fluke in the sense of he's just getting away with some nonsense. The routes have been incredible. From a success rate standpoint, Michael Wilson is at 78.4% success rate versus man and 81.3% against press. If you're not familiar with reception perception, like in depth with the numbers people out there, those are some of the best numbers for wide receivers in the NFL. Now, it's a 2-game sample. Obviously, his success rate versus zone is actually pretty low. He's more of a man press beater. But the reason that I think this is actually, again, I don't know if I want to call it sustainable or at least just not a fluke, is that Michael Wilson's strength as a prospect and in his rookie season profile was beating man and press coverage in the ways that we see him beat man and press coverage in these last 2 games, where it's a lot of the intermediate routes. It's kind of I would say a Michael Pittman-esque type receiver, but He certainly has a little bit more downfield juice maybe than Pittman does. So I'm really excited about what I've seen with Michael Wilson. And from a production standpoint, it's going to be tough to parse it out when Marvin Harrison gets back. But Boone, I actually think there are ways where these two guys from a deployment perspective can coexist.
Yeah, I find it interesting too. Like, it's two easier matchups that he's gone off in here, right? If you look back, and tons of props go to Jacoby Brissett for just totally turning around this passing attack. So I always feel the need to like mention him anytime I talk about the Cardinals, that I don't think we'd be seeing any of this happen if it was Kyler Murray under center still. But if you look back to the easy matchup that Marvin Harrison Jr. had when Brissett was starting, it was against the Cowboys defense, and he had a huge game, right? 7 for 96 and 1. Not quite what Wilson's done the last 2 weeks, but we've seen him have success in easier matchups. And I just wonder if he was out there in these last 2 games, would we have just seen him go off? Like, we were so primed for him to kind of continue this big breakout, and it gets stifled, right? Unfortunately. But to me, it's going to be very frustrating to try to project this when Harrison Jr. is back, whether that's this week or whether that's next week. It's going to be a really tough one to figure out because, from what I've seen, I almost feel like they need to keep feeding Michael Wilson, like go with the hot hand in the same way that they did with Brissett. And use these two guys. I mean, they can both have good games, yes, but I don't know that this offense is going to support all 3 of them having massive contests, including Trey McBride, of course, in there. So I worry that we're going to see somebody take a backseat. And the obvious guy that would take the backseat would be Wilson, because that's the way it was before we saw Harrison leave. But yeah, I don't know. It's a very tough one to parse here once Harrison Jr. comes back. You think that it's going to just be both of these guys having kind of good games interchangeably a little bit?
Well, and you think about it too, just to go back to that Cowboys game when Marvin Harrison had his biggest game of the season, Michael Wilson still had 61 yards in that game. He had that one long catch and run on the dig route as well. So, maybe it looks like that, right? But that could have easily been when you remove one guy, when it's clearly there's 3 guys to get the football here too. There's Trey McBride, there's Marvin Harrison, there's Michael Wilson. That's kind of it. I know they do the Greg Dortch stuff every now and again. I will say some of Drew Petzing's decisions to throw to like the UDFA with 3 career catches on go routes to win the game, I probably don't really need any of that anymore. But for the most part, there's only 3 guys to get the football here. So when you can condense it down to 2, and they're throwing the football at such high volume with Jacoby Brissett, who, I mean, hats off to Jacoby Brissett. He's just ripping throws out there, man. He is just ripping it. And just almost unconscionably, that's another thing watching Michael Wilson. He's open on these plays, but it's not, wide open on these plays, and he does not care. He's like, that's NFL open, and I'm taking the throws, and that has been really refreshing to see. So when you can condense it down to 2 guys in this situation, they are both going to go off, whereas when it's 3, it might look like the Cowboys game where Trey McBride goes, Marvin Harrison has a game, and then, Michael Wilson maybe is at that like 60, 70 yard mark. But Boone, the one thing I would say in terms of what does it look like when these 2 guys are on the field together, what's annoyed me about a lot of things have annoyed me about the Cardinals, but one thing that's definitely annoyed me about the Cardinals is just how static they've been with Harrison's usage as the X receiver only, because and I kind of forgot about this until writing about Michael Wilson and going back and looking at his rookie season profile. I said at the end of that rookie season profile, when 2023, the Cardinals had Marquise Brown as their X receiver, which is a choice. I didn't understand it at the time, but they did. 180 pound, whatever, Marquise Brown. It can't be pressed. Let's put him at X. So they had him as the X. And then when he got hurt, they essentially took Michael Wilson from this kind of move around flanker role and stuck him at X. And he had some pretty good moments as a rookie doing that. So in my head, I was like, okay, well, when they get Marvin Harrison in here, they can use these guys interchangeably. And you know what they did? The exact opposite of that. So my hope is that because we've now seen Michael Wilson, who's mostly been splitting between, he's pure perimeter, but a little bit of X, a little bit of flanker. Why can we not use him half at X and flanker, and then Marvin Harrison? Because I think that would get the best out of both and allow them both to have, usable fantasy games, as opposed to one guy goes off and one guy does nothing. That's kind of my hope and one of my biggest takeaways from charting this Michael Wilson 2-game stretch here.
And shout out Sigmund Bloom, the assumption of rational coaching, right? We think that's the best approach, but will they actually do it? I worry that the most likely scenario is they go back to the way it was, which you mentioned that like after Brissett took over, we were seeing some better stats from Wilson, right? Like Wilson had some games over 40 yards, 44, 40, 61. Like he was producing in those games, not finding the end zone, not putting up 100 yards like he has the last couple weeks. But if you look at the last couple weeks, you mentioned Greg Dortch, right? What was he doing? 66 yards, 53 yards. But Greg Dortch found the end zone in both of those games, so it made him a guy that you could slide into your lineup as a flex play. I wonder if that's just what it goes back to. We see Wilson go back down to 40, 50, maybe 60 yards. You hope he can get a touchdown, which would make him a wide receiver 3, wide receiver 4 flex option, somewhere in that range, depending on the matchup. And I think they try to make Harrison the guy again. That is probably the most likely scenario here, even though I think the offense as a whole, like you're saying, would be so much better if they got both these guys involved and kind of spread the love.
283 passing yards per game since Jacoby Brissett takes over. That leads the NFL. The Arizona Cardinals are number 1 in passing yards per game since Jacoby Brissett. And they've won one game. I realize they have not been a good football team. So all of these things are saying, see, do this smart stuff. And they still lose games. So that is definitely a part of it too. But I maybe you're right for the rest of the season that they go back to doing what exactly they did before. And I think that might be the case. But I will just say that if I'm a dynasty manager and I'm seeing what's happening right now, I'm at least kind of hopeful that maybe it's not this staff, maybe it's another group, or maybe this group gets another year and it's Jacoby Brissett again, that I think there's a little more talent here in Arizona than we've given credit for. And I would apply this logic not just to this situation, but to other spots too, where we kind of profile these wide receivers based on their production. And look, this is my whole axe to grind with, being alive. So fair enough to just ignore me on this. And you can, Boone, you could even tell me I'm an idiot. I'd be totally fine. But I do think that it's just one of these situations where like Michael Wilson was a guy that everybody kind of completely forgotten about, completely wrote off. But he obviously has some talent. He obviously has some ability. He can beat man coverage. And there are just a lot of receivers kind of in those situations when you don't know when the moment's going to come, but when the moment comes, they can absolutely be much more helpful than they were in any sort of these previous situations. So I think we can apply that logic as dynasty players, not just to Wilson, but also to other guys around the league as well.
Yeah, it makes him very interesting for Dynasty. And I'm curious about the last guy for the film room here, how you feel about him. Because in Dynasty, Harmon, I have a contending team that's getting a little older. My receiving core, you need to start 5 receivers, and it had completely fallen apart with injuries. And I went out and spent a 2nd-round rookie pick to get Wan'Dale Robinson. That was the state of things, how deep this league is, and the only real receiver available to me. And it's been pretty good. Like he's given me decent production. It's a PPR format. Like I said, start 5 receivers. So he's out there as like my 5th receiver, which is fine. But do we have some hope for Wan'Dale Robinson here? How's he looking?
Okay, first of all, just to take people into I've been so mean to Wan'Dale. Okay, I basically called him a fake receiver. I've called him a PPR scam. And I will say, you know what? I'm overdue for an apology to Mr. Wan'Dale Robinson for that, especially for this season. Wan'Dale Robinson is 8th in the NFL in receiving yards. 8th in the NFL in receiving yards. He has more receiving yards than Tedero McMillan, Zay Flowers, Devontae Smith, Emeka Egbuka, Chris Olave, Jalen Waddle, Nico Collins, Stephon Diggs, Roma Dunze, Cortland Sutton, Ladd McConkey. It's been, those are a lot of names that people were taking highly in fantasy drafts and very excited about, myself included. And Wan'Dale has just been more productive on a yardage basis, which is, again, crazy when you look back at last year. And this, to me, and again, I'm not saying this is right, but this was my thought process on Wan'Dale was, hey, like he is a guy that was only kind of running a fake receiver route tree as a prospect and as a rookie. And then last year, negative EPA per target, top 10 in targets, but 44th in receiving yards. But it struck me going back and charting some of his film. He has been just really good on these downfield routes, and it lines up with his average depth of target this year as well, which has jumped up not to crazy, but it's like 8. It's in at least viable receiver territory. So I think we do have something here with Wan'Dale. And again, I was really impressed with the breaking routes, outbreakers, digs in the intermediate area. He's snapping off man coverage, a tough man coverage team in the Detroit Lions this past week. And he was really winning at the catch point too. tough contested catches from Wan'Dale Robinson. There was one where he had an outbreaker against zone coverage. This wasn't a contested catch, but he catches it and Brian Branch comes and just obliterates him, and Wan'Dale Robinson holds onto that ball. So shout out to Wan'Dale, I think, for really improving his game. And I'm as guilty of this as anybody, but sometimes we see, I'm less guilty about it with players I know for sure are good, but sometimes when a guy I don't love the skill set, I'm like, well, all right, that's what he is, and he's never going to get better. And I think with Wan'Dale, he's clearly gotten better in the real receiver part of playing the position, and he looks very good as like a vertical slot option, and maybe has honestly been a little bit better playing outside this year too. He's played less in the slot this year than last year, which I think has actually been good for his skill set as kind of a speed-based player.
Yeah, for fantasy, I mean, he just ends up being a boomer bust wide receiver 3, though. Like you mentioned the stats and how good they are and how much better they've been. And yet it's come in like these really big chunks, these huge games like this past one that he just had. Because if you look at the 7 starts that Jackson Dart had, just a wide receiver 42 in fantasy points per game. And that was despite seeing double-digit targets in 3 of those 7 games. Like the volume has been there. And yet we're still not seeing huge production on a consistent basis, right? He kind of has an okay floor. No. He puts up a decent amount, but you get a few big games from him. And in terms of like what I'm looking for on that dynasty team, I'm more than happy to just get those odd big games from him and then steady production, even though if it's a little bit lower most weeks. So it's great that he's coming out like his biggest game of the year. I don't think people should expect that at all. He's a wide receiver 3 with a decent floor, could be that boomer bust guy. And I'm curious again to see what he could do the rest of the way. Like I said earlier, with the schedule that the Giants have, I'm happy to hear you kind of give that apology to him. And let's hope that he can and build off of this and continue with Jackson Dart coming back and finish the season strong. I wonder, how it's all going to fit together when Malik Neighbors comes back, because I think from a long-term perspective, he's still going to be capped in that way.
He's a free agent. Yeah.
Oh, he is a free agent after this season. I didn't even realize that.
Yeah. It's an interesting group of free agent receivers. It's like Wan'Dale, Alec Pierce, Rashid Shaheed, Romeo Dobbs, like kind of these contributor-based players. There's definitely a chance he could potentially be playing for a contract here. It's also worth noting, when we're talking about this Lions game, I tweeted the play out and I jokingly said, per the analytics, this is the longest anybody's been wide open during a play in the NFL. And people actually took it seriously. I'm like, yo, I'm kidding. It's just a joke, because Wan'Dale's open forever on that trick play where they throw it to Jameis, Jameis throws it and then they pitch it back to him, and then he hitches and throws it, and Wan'Dale's open like the entire time. So that was most of his production. I agree with you. He's going to be boomer bust, but I do think that he at least has potential for big games, which I would not have said that about the player that he was last year. I don't think he's about to become some superstar, and he's still got holes in his games that will not make him a consistent player, but he's capable of having those big games, especially if Dart gets back there. And like I said, Dart needs to get better as a passer. So a little bit of evolution, I think, from these other 2 guys we just talked about. So that has been fun to see, at least for me. And I think this was a fun segment to dive into. I will be honest with you, Boone, I would not have charted Wan'Dale if you didn't make me. So I'm glad you made me.
I'm glad that you went down that road, that we had to make you do it here. Yeah, absolutely. And it's always great hearing you do this stuff, man. You do a fantastic job with all of it.
Well, it better be at least halfway decent. This is what I think about for, 60% of the day.